close your eyes and summon everything the textbooks taught you about the sea: English pirates, the Spanish Armada, Viking longships cleaving the northern abyss, and a silence where we should have been. But beneath the rubble of a deliberately falsified narrative sleeps a titanic truth: that fleets bearing green and white war banners ruled 3 great oceans for more than 1,000 unbroken years. This history was not lost to careless forgetting, nor buried by some distracted scholar's neglect. It was erased by systematic doctrine, engineered by the architects of Western narrative when they wrote the sea's story. Open the naval history texts of London and Paris, and you will find Drake, Magellan, Columbus, Armada campaigns, and great Atlantic clashes. But you will search in vain for the name Khayr ad-Din. You will not find Sidi Ali Reis, nor Kano Giangre, the Iron Lord of the Indian Ocean, nor the Andalusian warriors of Islamic Crete, nor the Fatimid fleet that held the entire Mediterranean in its iron fist. That absence was no accident. It was an erasure, a deliberate act of annihilation performed by those who feared that the heirs of Islamic civilization might one day learn that their ancestors once drew the world's borders from the crest of a wave. This series was forged to shatter that erasure, to redraw the full picture as it truly was, without flattery to the West and without inflation for the East, armed only with the naked testimony of the historian's own documents. Welcome then to Masters of the Sea, the series that will return to you a complete history that was stolen and prove beyond all doubt that your ancestors were not merely children of the desert, but sovereign lords of the deep. From this opening episode, you must ask yourself the only question that truly matters. If Muslims commanded the seas for 1,000 years, why does almost no one know this, and why was the legend so thoroughly buried in shadow? The answer is neither simple nor comfortable, and we shall build it together, block by iron block, across 52 episodes spanning from the Battle of the Masts in 655 AD to the final fall of Algiers. This first episode is the gateway, not to any single battle, but to the complete map. The vast web of Islamic naval dominion stretching like an unbreakable iron chain from the shores of Morocco to the Straits of Malacca. Imagine the map before you. The ancient world rendered precisely as Al-Idrisi, the Muslim geographer, drew it, the man who gathered every ocean and sea into a single vision, with a mind that held no terror of the horizon. Across that map, from the Mediterranean's western shore to the Arabian Sea's eastern edge, from the Caspian in the north to the Bay of Bengal in the south, the Islamic narrative was inscribing itself in seawater and the blood of battles. Perhaps the most staggering revelation to any scholar who descends deeply into this history is that a people who emerged from the deserts of Arabia had, within half a century, begun laying warships in the shipyards of Alexandria. This is the miracle that Western history keeps in silence, that a civilization which learned the sea from absolute nothing became, within a handful of generations, the most terrifying naval force the Byzantine emperors had ever faced in their own waters. First, the Mediterranean, this sea that Western scholars name the cradle of civilization, was, for 3 consecutive centuries, an Islamic lake where no foreign keel dared sail without first seeking permission. From the Syrian and Palestinian coastlines westward, to the iron islands of Crete and Sicily, all the way to the sun-scorched shores of Algeria and Morocco, the Islamic naval chronicle was written in iron, tar, and consuming fire. The Byzantines, who had inherited Rome's most formidable naval doctrine, found themselves confronted by a rising force that recognized no such concept as impossibility, one that transformed every defeat into a lesson, and every lesson into an annihilation of the enemy. The Battle of the Masts, 655 AD, the first great naval clash in Islamic history, and the Muslims had been building their fleet for barely years, yet they stood against 1,000 Byzantine warships commanded by the emperor himself. They did not flee, they did not retreat into the shadow of the coast. Instead, they did what no Byzantine naval mind had ever conceived. They lashed their ships together, transforming the ocean itself into a land battlefield, and broke the pride of emperors. Within 73 years of that battle, Ibn Abi Sar and his successors had locked their iron grip upon the eastern Mediterranean, while the Umayyad fleet drew its western boundaries in fire all the way to the ancient walls of Constantinople. Islamic Crete, that island seized by exiled Andalusian Muslims in 827 AD, was forged into a naval fortress so formidable it haunted Byzantium's nightmares for 130 unrelenting blood-soaked years. And Sicily, whose conquest demanded 75 years of relentless maritime endurance, was opened by Asad ibn al-Furat, who commanded that first invasion while already past his 70th year, until the island became the most civilized territory in all of Europe. The Fatimids in Egypt, constructed during the 10th and 11th centuries, the largest and most technologically advanced war fleet the world had witnessed in that age, deploying classes of warship that European shipwrights would not understand for generations to come. And the forgotten naval Andalusia, the great arsenal of Almeria and Abdurrahman III, who secured every coastline from Gibraltar to Valencia with a fleet so fearsome it drove terror into the hearts of every northern Christian kingdom. Second, the Indian Ocean. Here, the grandeur reveals itself in a form that surpasses all comparison, for Islamic dominion over this vast expanse was never merely a military presence, but a total sovereignty, commercial, cultural, and military, seamlessly woven. Muslim merchants from Oman, Yemen, and the Gulf were sailing to India and China centuries before the very concept of European exploration was born, carrying across the Great Water their goods, their knowledge, their language, and their faith. When the Portuguese arrived at the Indian Ocean at the close of the 15th century, they did not discover an empty sea. They found an intricately architected network of Islamic trade routes and the battle fleets of the Sultanate of Calicut waiting in the harbors. And they found Kanhoji Angre, the Maratha Muslim admiral whose iron fleet terrorized the Portuguese armada for decades. The man in whose command not a single warship was ever defeated before the European invader during his entire long reign of the deep. The Ottomans, too, extended their armored reach into the Indian Ocean throughout the 16th century, dispatching great naval expeditions from the Red Sea all the way to the Bay of Bengal in defense of the besieged Islamic sultanates of the East. The Sultanate of Oman, that astonishing maritime power that inherited the Portuguese arsenals and fortresses, expelled them from all of East Africa and built an empire of iron and sails stretching from Muscat down to the fragrant shores of Zanzibar. The Omanis haunted the European presence in the Indian Ocean more than any other force, for they waged war in a manner that fused relentless guerrilla doctrine with the long-horizon strategic patience of an empire that never forgot its destiny. Third, the South China Sea. Here the Islamic presence was quieter in its temperament, yet no less vast in its depth. The Sultanate of Malacca, the Sultanate of Aceh, the Sultanate of Brunei, all standing as iron sentinels of the world's most vital maritime choke point. The Strait of Malacca, the gateway through which half of all world trade still passes today, was guarded under Sultan Mahmud II, the heir of the greatest commercial maritime empire Southeast Asia had ever raised from the dust of the spice routes. The full picture now stands complete and unassailable, from the Rock of Gibraltar in the west to the Straits of Malacca in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the shores of Zanzibar in the south. Islamic civilization wrote its naval legend without pause. But how does a history of this magnitude disappear? How do fleets that commanded 3 oceans vanish from the pages of every schoolbook? The answer lies in understanding precisely who wrote the history and what they wished to say. Naval history, as taught in Western academies, begins with Columbus's voyage of 1492, a full century after Khayr ad-Din's fleets already dominated the Mediterranean, and presents that starting point as though the sea had no sovereign lord before. When Western historians mention Muslims at sea, they reach for a single word: Barbary pirates, collapsing an entire 1,000-year naval civilization into one phrase, engineered to carry a preemptive verdict of guilt and a systematic expulsion from legitimate history. Yet the English thief Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish galleons and terrorized entire coastlines with open savagery, is solemnly addressed as Sir Francis Drake, his portrait hanging in maritime museums as the very icon of heroic national seafaring. That double standard is the first instrument of erasure, applying the measuring rod selectively so that what the Westerner does becomes adventure and glory, while what the Muslim does becomes piracy, barbarism, and a darkness that must be contained. The second instrument of erasure, the deliberate burial of primary Islamic sources. For the chronicles of Ibn Jubayr, Ibn Battuta, al-Nuwairi, and al-Makrizi overflow with Islamic naval testimony, yet Western universities relegate them all to the footnote and the margin. The Ottoman Admiral Sidi Ali Reis wrote over 1,500 pages on navigation and naval science in his masterwork, a volume that should sit on every maritime scholar's desk, yet it remains practically unknown in every Western school of naval history. And the map of Piri Reis, drawn in 1517, which charts the American continent with a precision that stuns modern cartographers, bearing evidence of navigational knowledge that should not have existed. This too is quietly shelved beneath the shadow of official narrative. The third instrument of erasure, the mythology of European discovery. For when the West celebrates Vasco da Gama as the discoverer of the Indian Ocean, it conceals the foundational truth that he arrived upon a sea already ancient with Islamic sovereignty. It was the Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, the Lion of the Sea, who guided Vasco da Gama from Mombasa to Calicut, and without that guidance, the great Portuguese discovery of the Indian Ocean would have foundered in ignorance for years more. That single fact alone is sufficient to dismantle the entire mythology of European oceanic discovery. For the Portuguese did not find an unknown sea, they found an Arab who knew it intimately and followed him along a route already written on the charts of Islam. The fourth instrument of erasure, the transformation of the great naval confrontations into Christian victories. For the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 is forever presented as a decisive European triumph, as though the story of the seas ended cleanly at that moment. What they conceal is that the Ottomans rebuilt their entire fleet from the keel up within 18 months of that battle and continued to hold sovereign dominion over the eastern Mediterranean for 2 full centuries after the supposed crushing defeat at Lepanto. That is the heart of the lie, not that Muslims were never defeated, but that their defeats are magnified into final epitaphs, while their victories are diminished, stolen, or presented through a distorting lens that strips them of all weight and consequence. And here, the question of collective memory becomes a weapon. A civilization that does not know its naval history cannot dream of a future naval power, and that is precisely the outcome that those who engineered this erasure wished above all things to achieve. Because the erasure was not merely a rewriting of the past. It was a deliberate destruction of collective will, for if a man is convinced his ancestors accomplished nothing of greatness upon the sea, he will never dare to dream that he might do so himself. What cuts most deeply is that this erasure sometimes found its willing accomplices within Islamic civilization itself, for Arab and Muslim historians have long prioritized the chronicles of land and neglected the dimension of the sea with a striking and costly consistency. Arab schools do not teach the Battle of the Masts, do not teach the conquest of Sicily, do not teach the Fatimid fleet, do not teach Khayr ad-Din, yet they teach Napoleon's naval campaigns and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in faithful and loving detail. The erasure has infected the Arab and Muslim mind itself. We became a civilization that memorizes the naval history of others, while forgetting that our ancestors once signed surrender treaties aboard the decks of their own victorious warships. But truth does not die. The fleet that fought at the Battle of the Masts still sails through the documents of the historians. The Fatimid Armada still bears witness in the Cairo Janaza records, and that truth will be told here, today, in full, and without mercy. Before the journey begins, episode by episode, these architects of naval terror deserve to be known face to face, not through cold introductions, but through the singular moment when each of them reached into the abyss and changed the course of history. The first, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the man who declared, "We will no longer be prisoners of the land," who took a desert civilization and placed it upon the open sea, building the first Islamic fleet from nothing but iron will and unstoppable vision. He was no sailor. He was not born within sight of water, but he possessed something rarer than any maritime lineage, a strategic mind that saw beyond the horizon and a political will that transformed that vision into ships and those ships into dominion. The second, Abdullah ibn Abi Sar, commander at the Battle of the Masts, the man who faced 1,000 warships with 200, and rather than seeking escape, invented a tactic the sea had never witnessed before, turning the ocean itself into his weapon. His doctrine was genius in its purest and most brutal form: chain ship to ship, transform the ocean into a land battlefield, let the superior ferocity of his ground soldiers overwhelm the emperor's sailors, and that is exactly, precisely what he did. The third, Khayr ad-Din Barbarossa, the crownless sultan, the son of a Greek potter who inherited the smoldering vision of his fallen elder brother Erasure and forged it into the most feared naval empire in the entire history of the Mediterranean Sea. Emperor Charles V, sovereign of all Europe, trembled at the sound of his name. The Pope dispatched crusading alliances against him. Venice and Genoa locked their harbor chains in dread, and that terror was built not from birthright, but from iron will alone. The fourth, Pierre Rice, not merely an admiral, but the mind that drew the world's boundaries in an age when the world was still mostly darkness and conjecture, whose legendary map contained navigational intelligence that preceded his own era by a full century. The fifth, Laqit ibn Ahmad al-Yarubi, the Omani imam who expelled the Portuguese from Fort Jesus at Mombasa in 1698, who returned the Indian Ocean to its rightful identity, and whose campaign still echoes in the doctrine of every maritime strategist who has studied it. The sixth, Kanhoji Angre, the admiral in whose command no single warship was ever lost to the enemy, who transformed the Konkan coastline into an inescapable iron hell for the Portuguese fleet, earning the name that followed him like a shadow, the terror that never sleeps. The seventh, Sultan Iskandar Muda of Aceh, the architect of the most powerful Islamic sultanate in Southeast Asia, who raised a war fleet that challenged Portuguese sovereignty over the Strait of Malacca with a ferocity and resolve that shook their empire to its very foundations. These are not all the heroes. They are merely the first dark cloud of a coming storm called Masters of the Sea, a series that will present across 52 episodes every commander who forged the Islamic naval chronicle in iron and salt and fire. In this series you will hear of the Battle of Diu in 1509, the first great clash of the Indian Ocean, where Ottoman and Egyptian forces met the Portuguese Armada in the opening confrontation of a war that would decide the fate of global maritime dominion. And you will hear of Lepanto in its full and unredacted truth, including the dimension the West conceals, that the Ottomans rebuilt their entire naval power and maintained their Eastern Mediterranean sovereignty for 2 centuries after the battle. The West calls their destruction. And you will hear of the Moriscos, the hundreds of thousands of Muslims condemned by the Spanish Inquisition's tyranny, secretly evacuated across the sea by Muslim corsair fleets in the greatest clandestine maritime rescue operation in the history of the medieval world. And you will hear of Saida al-Hura, the queen governor of Tetouan, who stood as Khayr ad-Din's sovereign ally, commanding naval operations across the western Mediterranean with a regal hand and a military mind that her enemies could never outmaneuver. And you will hear of Ahmad ibn Majid, the Lion of the Sea, who wrote over 40 treatises on the science of navigation, charting the winds, the stars, the currents, and the great sea roads with a precision that no navigator of his era could surpass. This journey will be not merely a chronicle of the past, but a reconstruction of identity. Because a man becomes capable of building the future only when he knows with absolute precision what his ancestors accomplished in the deep darkness of history. The Islamic naval inheritance is not merely a closed chapter. It is practical proof that political will, forged together with knowledge and industry, can transform a desert civilization into sovereign mistress of the world's mightiest oceans. And that lesson is precisely what the counter-narrative fears most. Because if the Muslim man of today truly learns it, he may suddenly decide to return to the sea and rebuild from the ruins what centuries of neglect and colonial doctrine tore down. The American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote in The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, "He who commands the sea commands the trade. He who commands the trade commands the wealth of nations, and he who commands that wealth commands the world itself." This iron doctrine that Mahan imagined a fresh discovery in 1892 was being practiced with surgical precision by Islamic civilization from the moment the first Muslim sailor cast off the moorings and pointed his bow toward the open horizon of Acre's harbor. The Islamic Straits of today, Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Malacca, the Bosphorus, the Suez Canal, are the very same choke points our ancestors guarded with iron and blood through centuries of unbroken naval vigilance, and they remain the keys to the world's throat. 40% of global trade passes today through the Strait of Hormuz, 28% flows through Bab el-Mandeb, a near equal portion moves through Malacca. Every one of these arteries of world commerce intersects directly with the Islamic world's geography. This is no geographical coincidence. It is a deep historical inheritance, proof that Islamic civilization never built its power upon shifting sand, but upon the certainty of the sea, and upon a profound understanding of what it means to hold the world's vital passages. Turkey today builds the drone carrier TCG Anadolu and develops advanced naval industries, and this is nothing less than the continuation of an imperial memory that never truly died but lay dormant across the long centuries, waiting to be reclaimed by a worthy generation. Indonesia, the fourth most populous nation on Earth, holds the longest Islamic coastline in the world, guards the southern approach to the Strait of Malacca, and rebuilds her war fleet with a steady, patient resolve of a civilization that knows its inheritance. History does not repeat itself, but it teaches lessons of iron permanence, and the most enduring of all those lessons is this: naval power is never built by longing, only by political will, investment in science and industry, and the cultivation of human mastery. That is precisely what Muawiyah did when he built the first fleet. He gathered Coptic and Syrian sailors, taught Arab soldiers the arts of the deep, invested without hesitation in the arsenals, and refused the paralyzing doctrine that said, "We are a desert people and cannot master the sea." And that is precisely what Khayr ad-Din did when he built his fleet from absolute nothing. He held no naval inheritance, commanded no state resources, yet he possessed vision, will, and the understanding that the sea grants its sovereignty only to those who persevere without surrender. Since the fall of Algiers in 1830, when the last Islamic cannon in the Mediterranean was silenced forever, the naval spirit of Islamic civilization has been searching for a generation willing to restore it to its natural station above the crest of the waves. And this series does not merely aim to inform you of what was, it aims to ignite something within you, that deep internal voice that speaks without warning and says, "If my ancestors built all of this, what is my reason for building nothing in return?" Because the civilization that knows the full chronicle of its greatness cannot be unmade by denial, and the man who knows his grandfather was an admiral will not accept the life of a man with no history, no doctrine, no inheritance to carry forward into the future. This is our mission, the restoration of memory, for memory is the first stone in the foundation of will, and will is the first stone in the foundation of a fleet, and a fleet is the first stone in the foundation of a civilization rebuilt from the abyss. In the next episode, you will meet Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the man who stood before Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab and spoke without hesitation. Commander of the faithful, the sea is the greatest and most terrible of God's creations. Grant us permission to sail it. Umar refused, gripped by a sovereign's protective fear of that vast and unknowable abyss of water. Yet Muawiyah never ceased his petition, for he alone could see what no other saw, that a man who holds the Syrian shore but not the sea before the Sahathawit. The coming episodes will prove beyond all doubt that Muawiyah's doctrine was pure iron truth, that the civilization which learns the sea and masters it and advances it becomes a force that cannot be broken, while the civilization that abandons it becomes a prisoner of those who sail above it. 1,000 years of naval sovereignty, 1,000 years of admirals, of charts drawn by starlight, of warships and desperate battles in impossible storms. This is not merely buried history, but the most powerful evidence that a civilization can rise again from its own ashes. In every wave that rolls across the Mediterranean, the memory of an Islamic warship persists. In every salt wind off the coast of Oman, the echo of a call to prayer lifted above the deck of a Muslim vessel sailing toward Malacca and all that lay beyond. And in every gust that crosses the Strait of Gibraltar, you hear the whisper of Rouge Barbarossa, who raised his one remaining arm to the sky and declared, "This sea is ours, and every man who denies it will one day confess it from the chains of our hull." History is merciless to those who ignore it. The civilization that forgets its naval chronicle wakes one morning to find foreign military bases encircling its own turrets, once commanded with sovereign contempt. The series is therefore no intellectual luxury, no exercise in comfortable nostalgia. It is a roadmap written in the blood of admirals, sailors, shipwrights, and navigators for every soul who wishes to understand the true doctrine of how naval power is built and sustained. Subscribe and share this history with every person whose blood should know it, because the propagation of true historical knowledge is a duty owed by all who believe that a civilization deserves to know the full and unredacted chronicle of its own greatness. Next episode, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the man who built Islamic naval power from nothing. And the journey from the burning desert to the open sea is the first chapter of an epic that will not end until the last wave breaks upon the last shore. We are History Legion, and this sea was ours, and we swear by every wave in the Mediterranean, every wind across the Indian Ocean, and every star that guided our ancestors' ships through the blackness of the ancient night. We will tell it all, without fear, without compromise.